I built this train-based mega base that I wanted to show off. The core mechanism uses large trains to move resources around. This train here, it's coiled up. This is the standard length train. These are 130 length. And these are single item trains. However, these mixed trains with mixed items have some variable lengths, but they can go up to 780 in length. And you can see here that it loops around, as in this is the beginning. This is the beginning of the train, and this is the end of the same train. This is one loop. And this is where we are. But this train goes all the way across. And that's the 780 length trains. So this base is fully vanilla. No mods, no editor. No spawning of resources. Pollution's still on. The resource spawner was set to max width and max depth. And the world was set to rail mode. It's the one where the biters don't spawn biters' nests. I think that's rail world. And the base is 5K science. So go to 10 hours and it works. Yep. The base can be divided into two main parts. You have the outposts and the core base, or the main base. The outposts produce or mine a single ore type and then refine it into a single item type. So this one produces iron plates. And we have different outposts for different resources. Like this one is for copper cables. This one is for steel. And these are all outposts, and they all produce different resources. From the outposts, they get transported on the train network into the main base. I think that covers. It's a good view of the main base. So on the left here, we have the main train network, and it extends out to the left to outposts. And it extends down and to the right to more outposts. And then next we have all these loop trains, and these are the buffers or stackers. And then to the right of the stackers we have the mixed trains. And this is where the main production happens. Let me... You can see it better. And basically, we have, these are divided into rows, and each row is like a different production line that produces different things. So if we look at this bottom row here, so we have the global train network, we have stackers, and then these are like inputs, and they're transferring resources from the single trains onto the mixed trains, and they're doing it for different resources, right? And then the mixed trains continue down into the production line, and along the production line they're producing all the different units, right? You saw green circuits, red circuits, blue circuits, speed modules, and then the rocket control units. And at the end of the line there's an output where it gets transferred off of the mixed train and onto another single item train, but this time with the output items. So, for example, this row produces rock control units, but this row produces yellow science. This row produces space science and consumes the science in the science labs. Then you have purple science here, yellow or blue science. Then we have low density structures and right, etc. And basically each row is like a production line and they produce different things. And each row produces a different item. Yeah. Let's have a look at one row or one production line in detail. We'll just look at the bottom one here, and this one produces rocket control units. So first, the resources are coming from the outposts, and then they come into the stackers, and these stackers start at the bottom here, and then wind in, and then wind back out, and they sit there, waiting for space on the input stations. Here's one. And while most stackers are like parallel tracks tightly grouped together in order to fit as many trains as possible in a small space, these stackers are curled in and windy because of the length of the train. They're just too long to try and have straight parallel tracks for the entire length of the train, and it actually takes up less space to curl to wind them in, even though it's obviously not that efficient with these big gaps in the middle. It's a common theme you'll see throughout the base is that because the trains are so long, most of the time when they're stored or being used, they're curled up or wound up in some way. Yeah. So if we're looking here, so this is like one input station, and you can basically think of it as like a reel-to-reel cassette. And in a reel-to-reel cassette, you have one side, you have it all wound up, and then you're slowly unwinding it to the other wheel. And as you do so, you're reading data across a small portion at the head. And basically here, we're winding the train up on one wheel and unwinding it on the other wheel. And then the head down here is where we're transferring resources from the single item trains to the mixed trains. So like the first cassette wheel here is this one. So coming off of the stackers, they'll be targeting this station. And here, once this train has cleared, it winds and winds and winds in until it hits this. And then it's able to back out. And then as it backs out in stages. And this one's currently at stage 3. And next it'll be going to stage 4. And each time it goes to the next stage, it exposes another set of wagons. And then down here at like the head basically. And then these exposed wagons are perfectly aligned such that you can just use direct insertion to transfer between the single item trains and the mixed trains. So one of the trickiest things about this build, about this input station, is the alignment issue and the issue of maintaining perfect alignment while going around curves, right? Because it's easy to maintain alignment when you have a straight line. However, we're curling here and we're uncurling here and we're curling back up here. And yet the wagons, all 6 inserters for every wagon are exposed and aligned perfectly so that they all can function. And that's the core trick of this input station. Earlier I said the standard length train was 130, and this is an example of a standard length train, but now that we know a little bit about the input station, we can go over the construction of the trains, because they are bidirectional. So the trains are like 2 6s, so 2 locomotives, 6 wagons, and they're bi-directional. We have the heads facing both direction. And then that pattern, I'll wait for it to move. Well, so that pattern's repeated 16 times. And then at the other end of the train, you put +2 in order to make 2 locomotives in order to make it perfectly symmetrical. And this way it can reverse in, it can, go wind in and then reverse out, and then over on that side, wind in again and reverse out, and right. It's symmetrical, so it doesn't matter. There is no front, there is no back. It's constantly changing direction. So in sum, these are 2 6s, bidirectional 2 6s times 16 plus 2. If that makes any sense. So then we can look at these mixed trains, because this is where everything happens. Well, I guess at the head here, where the resources are being transferred, I use cars as the 2x3 chests, because rails can only be placed, are even in size, therefore can only be placed in even distance away from a track, so that'd be 2 away or 4 away. You can't use just a regular inserter, chest inserter, because that's 3 spaces, an odd number. So you can use a car as an even sized chest, so you get inserter, car, inserter, so that's 4. There really is no other option, unfortunately. Red inserters are just kind of a joke. Belts are actually slower than direct insertion, and bots are just a waste to move it like 1 tile. So I mean, the cars work pretty well. So they're just they are annoying because they can only have 1 stack, or like you can have a whole stack of 50 chests, but you can only have a stack of 1 car. So when you need like all these cars here and all these, and like every one of these stations have cars, but you need that many cars, and it's just kind of annoying to deal with, especially when you're just using them as a chest. But other than that, it works pretty well. What else here? Oh yeah, you might see some bots flying around. It is the base is terrain based, but things like refueling, there's a couple little things that use bots, and refueling is one of the main ones. So it's unfortunately it's not quite a train only base. What else was I gonna say here? Okay, so yeah, so now this one's passing. So this train is now on its last stage here. So we've been seeing it slowly tick through the stages and unwind, and now we'll see a new train. Once this one passes, we should be seeing a new one come in and target the station, right? Yeah, so here it comes. So this is how you swap between your trains, or you swap between like reels basically. So it just winds in. Hits the stop, and then it reverses out. So now this is the head of the train. And then when this one's done, we'll just hurry up a little bit. It doesn't matter. There's enough buffer. So we'll just say that one was done. And it comes out. It'll unwind. So there is some downtime as you're swapping between trains, or as like the trains are going from station to station. But this is taken up by the buffer inside the cars, and the cars have no filters, so they're completely full. For the cables here, I mean, that means there's a ton of resources sitting in these cars. For some of the other resources, like, I don't know, like the end products like rock control units where the stack size is smaller, an entire car full of them is not that many resources. But here it's a lot of resources. So it wound up, it backed out, it waited for the other one to clear, and then it came through. And now it's sitting here. Now to actually talk about these mixed trains, it's so easy to get distracted because there's so much going on and everything was a puzzle of sorts. And especially at this scale, there's something with every build, And I mean, that's what makes it so great. But now to actually talk about these mixed trains. So these trains are divided into sections, which are repeated, just like the smaller versions. But these are made a little bit differently. So first of all, they're single direction. So all the heads or all the locomotives are facing the same direction. And the wagons, there's 6 wagons times 2. And these are 12 wagons per section. And these are determined by these standard length trains, how these are laid out. So you just have to mirror it so that they can line up. And then you just fill in the rest of the space with locomotives. So, right, you line up the wagons, and then you need space for all this curling and winding to happen. You just need some gaps in between. And you just fill them with locomotives. So the net result is that you have 4 6s times 2. So you have 4 locomotives, 6 wagons, and you do that 2 times per section, which means you end up with 20 total length between one section or between 2 train stops. And then you repeat that for as many stages as you need. So this bottom one, right, here you go, start at W1, 2, right, and then, 8, 13, and then 18, 19, and then it goes to full length, and it winds across the bottom. We get 37, 38, 39. So the total length would be 20 times 39, which is like 700, or no, yeah, 780. And some of the ones that require less processing, like purples, right? It doesn't go the full length, so you end up with shorter trains, and the largest station is only 31 versus 39. Let's. So this is an example of a main processing or assembly section. Like before, we were looking at input sections. This is where the assembly happens. And one of the core principles here is that the assembly machines are pulling and pushing from the same exact wagon. So they're pulling copper cables and iron plates out of the wagon and then putting green circuits back into the same wagon. This is different from a lot of setups I've seen where resources come in on a train, get processed, and then get put on a different train to go out. And because everything is being pulled and pushed on the same wagon, the wagons have to be fully filtered, right? You can't have any blank spaces. This means that all inputs, outputs, and intermediate products must have a slot available to them in the wagon. So this is green circuits, but one section of greens may not be enough, so there could be multiple sections of the same production. So we have another section of green circuits, and then here we have red circuits, which use the exact same pattern, but now they're producing reds. And even though greens and reds both use copper cables, because there's a cap on the green, the green circuits will only consume enough cables as to fill up the green circuits. Therefore, they won't use up all the coils, and there'll be some left over for the reds, right? So the greens were full, but there's still some left over, and that's part of the why the filtering comes in, so that you consume. It puts a cap on consumption and it puts a cap on output, right? So reds, right, take a long time. 9.5 seconds. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 sections of reds. Then there's blue circuits. And of course you need sulfuric acid for blues. I won't, I'll cover oil and all the oil products later, because that's a whole process in of itself. So I'll just kind of skip over the oil products for now. So you just have sulfuric acid coming in to be able to produce the blues, and then you have what are these, speed ones? Yeah. And speed 2, or still speed ones. And then you have the same pattern for all the rocket control units. And then when you get to the end here, this is the same as the input stations, just instead of going from the single item trains to the mixed trains, they're output stations now. And they're going out, and you only need because you're producing and you're producing and reducing, you only need a small output compared to the input, right? And these are just buffers for these output stations. Now at the end of this assembly line, we have a train full of rocket control units. So this one's in the process of getting filled. So where does that go? That goes to another assembly line. But this is kind of the end destination of all these assembly lines. And this is the white science production and science consumption line. So let's just go here. So it follows the same principles that we first have our input stations here, and we have rocket control units, low density structures, rocket fuel, and then we have all the sciences coming in. So we have red and green. And this base can also switch to military at any time as a full assembly line for that as well. And then blue, purple, and yellow. And the first assembly stop is the white science, right? So inside these wagons, we have a equal amount, 11 slots for each of the rocket types, rocket components, and then a slot for each of the different sciences. And they just get put in. There's a little bit of wiring because there's limited buffers, and I mean, it's kind of interesting. Like, the rocket silo is the only building in the game that deletes resources, which is just, I don't know, I always found that kind of odd. Like, why isn't there just like another check marker here that says please don't delete resources or something like that? I don't know. Anyway, so I mean, if you don't want it to delete resources, you need to put a little bit of circuitry on it. So, and there's a little bit of circuitry and a couple of lights to show what's happening, because you can see here, like, this one's ready to launch, but it's red because it already has plenty of white science. And if you're going for 5K science, you don't need this many. I mean, I don't remember the exact number. You don't need, what is that, 6 and then 12. You don't need 12, but in order to fill out the design and make it symmetrical, you do need 12. So then you need some circuitry to turn them off. And you can see, right, it's still red, and this one's red. And it'll turn green when there's enough space and it's ready to launch. And you just gotta do that because otherwise it'll delete resources. But, so it fills up the, fills up the white science. And then, really the map, the rest of the line, it's just pulling from the wagons and just putting it in science labs. The whole rest of the thing is science labs. And at the end, there is no output station because the science gets consumed. Right. Now, you will notice that I do use bots in order to transfer satellites a few feet over. One of the reasons is that you have to do all these filtering, and sometimes the math just doesn't work out evenly for you. So for example, if I had to, if I put a satellite in here, well, then I'd have an unequal amount of, I'd still need one for each of the sciences, but then I'd be unequal amount for the different rocket components. So then I'd have to leave two, I just have to like block off two spaces then, which is just kind of annoying. So I do use bots here to move the satellites. Also, during like the prototyping stage and like during testing phases, having the satellites as a quick and easy way to just like turn on and turn off the system instead of having them, you know, buffered into the system and taking potentially like 5 hours for the buffer to clear sometimes, depending on like what's going on. And then like, so it'd be like a reset would take like 5 hours or something like that. So I'd be better off just like reloading the game, but just having the just like loading an old save basically would be quicker than waiting for the buffers to clear, which is just kind of happens at this scale when you're using large trains like this. Because like if you look at the buffers in this train, like each wagon only has one slot of white, yet there's 876,000 just sitting on this train, just being moved around. Because like at most there's like 200, but these stack to 2,000. So there's always just like 1,800 extra just sitting here. So I mean, just like starting and stopping during the prototyping phase kind of just, it made it easier just having the satellites separate. And then I just never got around to, and then because of odd numbers, I never integrated them back into the system. So a little bit of sore spot. It's not fully bot based, or it's not fully train based, but it's pretty close. So that's, so this is kind of like the end place for most of these. So right below that, in between that, we have yellow science. Above this we have purple. Then we have blue, low density, military. Red and green are combined because they just use a minuscule amount of resources compared to everything else. And then we have satellites. Right, and then engines. So this was kind of a mistake, but engines are here. And then we have rocket fuel. Right, that's a long one. And then we have a couple of duplicates because of the purple and the yellow and the rocket control units, they use so many resources, or you know, the stack sizes aren't that high, and the intermediate count is quite large. You end up needing multiple rows for some of these, so the purples, the yellows, and the rocket control units get duplicated in order to reach the 5K, whereas like the red and greens, they only need one, and they don't even need this much, kind of thing. It's just kind of how it works. And then at the top here, This isn't part of the science, but I made a, well, I guess just rockets. I think you can either pull explosive rockets or the normal ones out, and because this is what I primarily use for defense. How does one design an assembly line or assembly row, and also what does the train schedule look like? So, I mean, the schedule comes from the design, but it is fully time based, as in it never looks at the cargo contents. It just uses a static time, and each stop is the same time, and it just goes through in order, and at the end it just loops around again to the start, because the track is a loop. So then, if there are no cargo contents being looked at, how why is 17 seconds the correct answer here, kind of thing? And this comes down to the design, and I guess I'll go into the design. How does one design? I mean, kind of, you have to use a spreadsheet, but I'll go give an overview. So basically, when you're making a row, you have to decide what your input products are, right? And then what your output products are. And then from that, you got to figure out what all the intermediates are to get from your inputs to your outputs. And you got to figure out what your filters are in your wagon, right? Like what all the filters are. Basically, what you're figuring out is, if you fill up a wagon full of inputs, how many outputs can you produce per wagon? Right? One wagon is able to hold how many outputs? And then you multiply your production per wagon times the number of wagons in a section. So for me, that would be 6 and 6, that'd be 12. So then one section can produce this many outputs. And then something else you gotta figure out is you gotta come up with a quota, right? How many outputs do you want? What's your goal here? And for like yellow science here, it would be 2.5k because there's 2 of them. For like the blue science, it would be 5k because there's only 1 of them. But basically, now that you have your production per section and your quota, you can calculate the minimum speed of the train in order to reach that quota. But you don't care about the speed of the train. You're interested in the inverse of that, which is how long can a train be stopped before it has to move again. And that's where you get your well, that sounds very similar to this. How long can it sit at this station before it has to move to another station? And that's basically like the minimum speed of your train based off of your quota and based off of how much product can you hold in one wagon. While it moves every 17 seconds, that movement takes time too. And that movement's like about 6 seconds, maybe it's 7. I generally just call it 6 seconds. So I'll just basically call this like one cycle is, I'm just gonna estimate it at like 20 seconds. And the key here is that, so if you have 6 seconds of movement, that means that 25% of the time the train is moving. And while the train is moving, assemblers, or right, those are where's my assemblers, cannot pull or push items from the train, right? Because it's moving, and you can't do that while the train's moving. And this means that for some, it doesn't matter. So like for red circuits, the number of resources for one red is fairly low, and the length of time for the rut to actually produce is pretty long, which means that if it's during that 6 seconds while the train is moving, there's enough of an internal buffer that the assembly machine will never stop. It could, but it's unlikely, right? Because it's moving, and this one's still going, right? And doesn't have enough. Well, okay, so at the very end it stopped because it ran out of resources. So for most of the time, it's fine. But this is worse for other resources like greens, where they're producing so fast and consume so many resources. Well, I mean, this is done because the wagon's full, but I don't really have an example right here. But it chews through its internal buffer so fast that 6 seconds it takes for the train to move to the next station, the assembly machine will have to go idle in that time because it doesn't have a large enough internal buffer. So the longer that the train can just sit at the station, the better, right? In other words, the higher percentage of the time that the train is stationary, the more efficient the assemblers can be. So this one's at 14 seconds, but so that's pretty fast. This is one of the faster ones. But in order to reach the quota of resources at the end, there is a minimum speed that the train has to go. So when you actually build it and you see that, like, oh, these assembly machines are idle a little bit too much, they need a little bit longer, so you may need another station producing some, or you may have to speed up the train just a little bit, or you may have to slow down the train just a little bit to make it all work out. So it's, fortunately, you can't just take it all from the spreadsheet, but it gives a pretty close to like the exact times that you want. But what I haven't talked about much is all of the outposts which supply the main base. And these make up a significant portion of the base. So that's all of these, some of these down here, and then some of these over here. Just to cover it, this is like a prototype version, and like a version of V1. It's disabled for the most part, but I just kind of left it there and then just built next to it, and there's no connections between them. But instead of just demolishing it, why not just build next to it, right? And this was the original bus-based belt, bus-based base, BBB. All right, sure. And then this is like the mall, and this is more like module production in the style of the prototype base. And then this is just the solar panel array, but there's some outposts in here. But so the outposts are using the same ideas as we've seen elsewhere. So here, so this is like the input stations where we have a reel-to-reel cassette, but this time, instead of the head just transferring resources, it's mining resources, and then it's smelting them, because this one is producing iron. This outpost is producing iron plate. So here we have our cassette winding in, and then it's going to back out, and then it's going to step by step go through mining and then smelting and then multiple smeltings. And it does this step by step, kind of unwinding or rewinding. Depends how you look at it. And then when it's done, it just goes back out into the global network, goes to the main base. The main base puts it through an input station and then empties it, and then it comes back to here, and then it gets filled up again. And these are using those standard length trains of 130 length. And here we have on one iron patch, or one patch of resources, basically all I can fit are two production lines. So this is symmetric across the middle here, and there's two production lines. And the reason why I can't really fit more than two is because, well, part of the reason is that in the spacing between them, I need to put a inserter, an assembler, and then a beacon, and then an assembler, and then another inserter. And that happens to be odd, so you just kind of end up with an extra space to make it even. But this means that in this arrangement, I can only put them this close together. And it's... So then you say, why not just put another one here? But then the problem is that with these miners, they have to be on the ore patch themselves. And like, I might be able to squeeze it in. I mean, I might not be able to squeeze it in. And I wanted a more universal design. And with the max size ore patches, I found that 6 wagons in parallel like this is about the most that I can guarantee. It becomes very problematic if like these end ones happen to run out, or you know, these ones don't quite fit in and like 1 or 2 miners don't get coverage, or because they don't get coverage or they run out too quick or something like that, and it kind of just breaks the whole system. So that's why I've kind of based it off as 6 wagons, because that's about all I thought I could fit in on the average ore patch. So this one obviously probably could fit a little bit more, but like on every single ore patch, I can fit 2, right? Like here's one where it's kind of slightly oblong. You can kind of trace the patch there. And I don't think I could fit 3 in there. And if I did 7 wagons, I don't know if I could fit 7 wagons, right? 7 wagons worth of miners long. Maybe, maybe not. I kind of erred on the side of caution and went with 6. And that's kind of where the standard length of 6 wagons, 2 locomotives came from. If I was more ambitious, I could have tried to do 7 long or something like that, but I wanted to be able to just stamp them down wherever, and having them be as short as 6 or as long as 6 is about as long as I think I could get away with, right? Because you can have some pretty odd shaped ore patches. But so this was iron ore. This is an example of cables. So you can see it's labeled iron ore to iron plate to copper cables. And it's the same exact principle we've been seeing. You go mining, then you have your smelting stations. And then for copper cables, all you need to do at the end is just tack on some assemblers, and then you have copper cables then. This is the same for, here's steel. So steel gets particularly long. So we have iron ore, iron plate, smelting, and then steel smelting. Right, and then like this is a double, right? Because there's two paths, so it's two assembly lines basically. Is this working? Yeah, it's just kind of capped because I don't really use military science, so I mean it still cycles through, but it's not really producing anything because I haven't really been doing any military. I've been doing mining productivity and a couple followers and worker speed, so these don't need military. What else is there? Coal is pretty simple. You just mine it directly onto the train. Stone is the same. Copper plate is the same as iron plate. I guess I just have a blank one in there. Alright. One unique thing to note about these single item trains is that there are no filters on the wagons. So any of these slots can either be filled with iron ore or iron plate. And you can see that they kind of just randomly fill in wherever the next available slot is. So that brings up the pretty major concern of the inputs, or excuse me, the outputs are targeting the inputs, as in they could be going to the same place. And if the wagon's full, why doesn't it block? Or how much of a concern is it that it might block? Because obviously it doesn't really block, otherwise nothing would work. But the follow-up question to that is, how fragile is the system? How likely is it to cause a blockage and then cause other failures later on? The answer is it is very stable and not fragile at all. So let me explain why. So in this furnace, in each furnace, you have two internal buffers. You have the input internal buffer, and this is guaranteed to hold at least 3 iron ore. Because if it goes below 3 iron ore, less than or equal to 2, it triggers an inserter to bring in more iron ore from the source. So you get +3 here. And then on the output, it can hold an entire stack of iron plates, so that's 100 iron plates. Now with no productivity, that means that would equal to 50 iron ore. However, with 20% productivity, basically every iron ore represents 1.2 iron plates, because you get one iron ore, you get 1 iron plate and 20 points on the productivity scale, right? Inversely, that means that every iron plate is equal to 1 over 1.2, which is equal to 0.833 iron ore. So basically, with the productivity, every iron plate equals 0.833 iron ore. So a stack of iron plates equals basically just 83 iron ore. So, which means that this output buffer can hold 83 iron ore. The input buffer is guaranteed to hold at least 3 iron ore. Therefore, this one furnace and its internal buffers can hold 86 iron ore, right? And then you multiply in each wagon. At each wagon, there's 4 furnaces, so that's 86 iron ore times 4. That's a lot of iron ore. So what happens when what causes a blockage is that it's unable to clear a spot in order to put the output. So here is able to clear a spot, and now it can put the output there. So blockage will only occur if there's no way to resolve or clear one single slot. But because the furnaces can hold 86 each, in total, you can hold 6 slots. You can pull out 6 slots worth of iron ore, but all you need is to pull out 1 slot worth of iron ore. So you basically have 6 times more space than you actually need in your buffers, which means that it's very unlikely for it to cause a blockage, right? And the core concept here, the core idea that allows this to happen, is that density is increasing as you process. Density is increasing, and this is because iron ore stacks to 50 and iron plate stacks to 100. So each stack of iron plates represents, as we showed before, 83 iron ore, right? So each slot can hold either 50 iron ore if it's in iron ore form, or 83 iron ore if it's in iron plate form. So density is increasing. As you're converting more and more iron ore into iron plate, density is continuing to increase, which means that the only potential spot for blockage is at the very first wagon, when you need to clear one spot in order to convert one slot from iron ore to iron plate. But the furnaces, obviously, with their internal buffers, have plenty, and because there's 4 per wagon, there's more than plenty. And then, therefore, there's no blockage. So here we have an example I set up. So this is one wagon, and it's completely full of iron ore. Right, so if you convert that iron ore all into iron plate, it consumes this much, right? And so then it increases in density by this many slots, right? And if you convert that iron plate into steel, it produces just this amount of steel, which means it's a tremendous increase in density because these are all empty slots now. So say I were to run the train through, right, the steel here. So you get your ore and you do all your smelting. It comes through, it goes through all the stages, right? And then I would to send it off to the main base. I'd be sending it off to the main base with only, what is this, 576 steel in every wagon. In other words, the train would be like, what is that, 75, 80%, like 80% empty, basically. And this was a problem. Train congestion kind of crept up on me, and one of the issues was that I was sending around these pretty much empty trains back to the main base, and then they'd quickly empty, and then they'd have to go all the way back out, causing a lot of congestion issues. So the solution is that, well, instead of just sending it through once, you send it through a second time, and then you send it through a third time, and then you send it through a fourth time. So basically, it just loops in several times at the outposts. This way, it doesn't have to go out to the main train network and cause congestion issues. This means that because the trains stops, there's so many stops because it's a long process. There are, hold on, what is it? 31 stops, right? So it goes through 31 stops, resets, and then does another 31 stops, resets, does another 31 stops, resets, right? So 4 times. The schedule gets obscenely long and really annoying to work with. Right, so see if I can find an example. Right, so we're looking at I want not stations, trains. What are we looking at right here? So we're not looking at this one here. you can see you can see that this is the train schedule. So across the top, you go through your unload stations, then you go to start, and then 3 resets. And each one of the in between those resets are 31 stations. This is what is this? 32 times 4. I just call it 120 plus another 10 or so. So it's like 140. And I probably should make him go through another 5th time. But it just gets so annoying to work with these setups. Because if you want to change anything, oh god, it's so much work to just like drag everything around, and these are so annoying to work with. I mean, I probably should have looked for a mod to see if you could just like import and export train schedules to text files or something. I mean, I wanted to keep it vanilla, but oh god, this was probably the most This is probably the most annoying aspect of this entire build, is managing these like 100+ station long schedules and just changing one thing in them. Oh, oh well. Did it. It works. So just like the mixed trains, the schedules for these are time-based and they never read the contents. The cargo contents. And the unload times are static and constant for all the unload stations, and the outpost times are static and constant for all the outpost stations. These are calculated using a spreadsheet as well. I'll just kind of skip over this one. Same basic principle as the mixed trains, but different parameters. Yeah. A major piece of the puzzle that I haven't covered yet is petroleum and all of the petroleum byproducts. And this mainly includes plastic and rocket fuel, and then you need a couple of byproducts of sulfur and heavy oil. And oil is interesting in Factorio because it's the only recipes that you have alternate recipes for. So for like circuits, it's iron plates and copper cables, and that's it. However, with the oil, you have your first step, you have 3 options: basic, advanced, or coal. And then at the second step, you can either decide to crack or not to crack by using the solid fuel recipes. And then there's like another matrix of options on top of that, because you have the option of, for trains at least, you can either do liquid wagons or you can do barreled wagons, right? So it's really just as like a matrix of options. And definitely doing the oil, I went through several iterations, and I finally ended up with one that I liked, but I didn't get there first try. Let me just hop in. So I'm just gonna head here first, but so this was my first attempt, I guess. And this one is on a coal patch, so it's direct insertion coal, and then it's mining, and it's producing plastic. So the like the coal mining and plastic plants are same way that all the other outposts work. However, attached to it at the end here are the oil refineries, and then these are configured to be advanced, and then they crack heavy to light, and then light to petroleum, and then they feed in the petroleum via pipes to all of the plastic stations. So it works, but there's a couple of problems. So the first is you need a specific location. That is, you need a coal patch next to an oil patch next to water. So the water's not too hard, but the oil and the coal have to be close together. And it's not really scalable. It's also really annoying to set up, which makes it even less scalable. So all of these advanced refineries and cracking, these you can just stamp down because they're symmetrical. But all of the piping for all of the oil and all the piping for all the water, I mean, it's just an annoying amount of water to try and route through here. And this is shows kind of one of the problems of cracking is the water, and it's kind of annoying to route the water around. And yes, I know that you can install a mod and you just place water blocks like you do landfill, and I know it's not really cheating because, like, I mean, at this point biters are irrelevant, so who cares. But I like to try and keep it vanilla and solve problems in the vanilla base with, like, it's, if you just solve your problem by installing a mod, then you're not really solving the problem. You're just kind of like skirting the rules, kind of speak. And I like the challenge of solving the problem with the tools you're provided, even if those tools aren't adequate, kind of thing. So so the problem with this is that you need a special location, you need a lot of water, and it's not very stampable. So then I made a second version, and that second version is over here. So here we have our oil patch, and now we're doing advanced refinery, and I'm cracking it all, but I also have a siphon off for lube. But instead of being fed directly into, like, the use case, it's being fed into fluid wagons, trains with fluid wagons, right? And the key here is that there's a separation between the use and the production. So now I have an oil outpost that I've siphoned off a little bit of lube, and then the petroleum can go wherever it needs to go. And these are just waiting bays, right? That's the refueler. And this is a step in the right direction, but I've caused other issues. And one of these issues is that I've used fluid wagons. Now, the problem with fluid wagons is that they basically, like, wagons can be used around curves and be aligned around curves, as you've seen and I've been using pretty much everywhere. And technically, fluid wagons can be aligned around curves too. I've seen pictures of the mythical pump being attached around a curve, or, well, multiple curves. But on the item wagons, the margin for error is much greater than the margin for error on the fluid wagons. And this means that I cannot just stamp down one of these input-output stations and the pumps will attach around the curves or wherever they're going. They just won't work, right? Because it's a more strict. And this means I'm pretty much forced to just use straight trains. But I try to make them as long as I can, because, right, so I have a standard kind of setup is a bidirectional 2-6, but like 6 fluid wagons is like literally nothing. So then you double that, and then you double that again, so you end up with 24 fluid wagons. And it's okay. It's still just not that much, unfortunately. This design simply won't scale particularly well to the size base I want, because I want these to be 100. I want 130 fluid wagons, right? But all I can realistically get is 24, because I have to keep them straight. Whenever I want to use them, I have to keep them straight, and it's just very annoying. This was a good second attempt, and kind of like as you saw with like, I had a prototype version of the base, and I have like this first version. I don't know, I don't like destroying stuff. I like to just like, if it works, it works. There's no need to like just demolish it because it's slightly not what I want. Because if I've already gone through the trouble of building it all and implementing it, I might as well just leave it. But I do like to do iterative improvements, and I like to leave the trail of progress behind that I've made. I think it's always cool to come back and reflect on like how I actually ended up where I did and such. But so I mean, it works and it's here, but it's not quite everything I wanted. So the next version then, I'll start over here then. So this is same plastic setup. All right, so we have mining coal, direct insertion, then we're producing plastic with the same setup, and we're piping in the petroleum. However, this time the petroleum is coming from barrels. Turns out the solution I wanted this whole time was barrels. That's not where not what I expected when I started this, but that's kind of where I ended up. And one of the key improvement with barrels is that cargo wagons work around curves, or they have a higher tolerance for working around curves. Therefore, I can have my large trains, even though barreled trains are like, what is it, 20%? I don't remember what it is. Like, they can hold like, I don't know, like 20% less fluid than the fluid wagons. Because they can work around curves, well, they can more easily work around curves. I can use my standard input station and my standard length trains of 130, and this way I can hold way more than I could in just any straight line train. Because one of the core principles or core designs of the base is that the inputs and the outputs get pushed to the same train wagon, this makes loading, or in this case unloading, petroleum with barrels actually really easy, because you pull out a full barrel, you empty it, and then you push the empty barrel back into the train. Now these trains have no filters on the wagons, so they can all be empty or they can all be full. So it's important to keep the exact right amount of barrels in each wagon. And this means that the train schedule can't just be time-based. It has to look at the cargo contents. And as it's unloading, going from full to empty barrels, before it moves to each station, every wagon in the currently exposed, right, that can be transferred, must be fully emptied of petroleum barrels, and then it must be fully filled back in with the empty barrels, and it won't advance to the next outpost or to the next step unless that condition's met. And then the inverse happens for filling it up, where it won't advance to the next step unless there's a set number of filled barrels in. In this way, the barrels go in, get emptied, and come back, or they go out, emptied, and come back in, and then you don't have any loose barrels anywhere in the system. All the barrels are self-contained to the wagon and to the stage. And this also means that creating one of these, a new train, is actually pretty easy, because you can stamp down the train and then you can just send it to like a station to fill up on empty barrels, and this one just like I have here. So you can just stamp down the train, fill with empty barrels, and then send it off to get filled, which makes it actually really easy to set up and really easy to use, and you can scale out the number of trains really easily because the barrels never actually leave the trains because they get put back on the train, either emptied or filled depending on what you're doing. So then where does this train get all of its barrels filled at? And that's where we were here. So you go from pump jack to basic oil refinery. Then you get petroleum out the other side, and you just fill it in. And then you have the same input station. This one's turned on its side. I guess technically it's an output station. It doesn't matter. And this will fill the barrels with petroleum. And one thing that's nice about this setup is that it's very simple. It's just basic oil processing, and it's very scalable because you don't need any water. Because with the basic oil refinery, you don't need to do any cracking in order to turn it all into petroleum. And one of the things that makes this more scalable than my other setups is that there are no pumps anywhere in this build here. And this is important because after kind of like looking through, a lot of the other builds use a lot of pumps, and the pumps are kind of like splitters, as in they just add UPS calculations because you're just adding fluid boxes and you're adding like a divider, because on one side fluids will behave differently than they will on the other side of the pump. So you're just kind of adding in calculations, and it's best to just avoid that. So this is good for plastic and for all the things you need, and all the things that need petroleum. However, still need to resolve rocket fuel, right? Because rocket fuel requires light oil, and there is no way to get light oil out of this process. If we go to the rocket fuel row, so that's this row, basically there's only one input, and that input is crude oil. Then locally that crude oil gets turned in with the advanced refinery and some water. It's turned into all the three products. So you have light oil, petroleum, and then down here we have heavy oil. But the thing is that I don't do any cracking, and that's because I just turn the petroleum and the heavy directly into the cubes, energy cubes. You know, I just lost the name of it. The energy cubes, close enough. And this way I don't have to deal with any water, and I don't have to deal with any cracking. So here I'm also siphoning off a little bit of lube. Again, this uses the fluid wagons because you need so little, it doesn't matter. Yes, this is overkill, but I didn't bother to calculate it, so I just put a bunch down. And these, the cubes are being, the solid fuel, that's the name, are being directly inserted into the wagon. Right, and here we have the petroleum being cubes being put directly into the wagon. And then you need some light oil turned into cubes as well. And then later in the line, we get to the rocket fuel, and it's pulling the cubes out and putting in the rocket fuel. And you have some supplementary cube production later on. And that's the rest of the rows are just producing rocket fuel. And at the end, you pull out the rocket fuel. And that's pretty simple. And the crude oil comes from one of these input stations, right? So we have empty barrels here, and then we have our crude oil filled here, and it just gets filled up. And it just gets piped in. Each assembly machine gets its own own pump and its own pipe, and that's pretty quick. And the final thing here is the sulfuric acid, which I made a dedicated build for. So first you have, yeah, let me jump around a little bit more. So you have sulfur, which gets directly inserted for blues, gets created here. So what I end up shipping in petroleum. The petroleum comes in the barreled trains, and these come in from the petroleum spot that we saw earlier. And then the sulfuric acid gets directly inserted, and then it gets used in blue production. But I also need sulfuric acid, and I do this separate because one, you need it in a bunch of different locations, but two, it also consumes a lot of water. So I found it easiest to just set it up to do it over a landfill, and then you could just have water wherever you need it. And it's kind of odd and different shape than the other ones, partially because I wanted to do it over the water to make it line up. Yes, these are not one-to-one, but in order to stack them in the trains like this, so they could fit them side by side, and just have direct insertion, I can only really do one-to-one, so these do turn off some of the time. You don't quite need one water per set of plants here, but you need, like, it's something like 60% of one pipe full or something like that. I mean, you need a lot of water, and I mean that's why it's done over the water. And then another little side project I have here is the rocket fuel, or excuse me, the nuclear fuel, which uses to refuel all the trains. So same idea as the rocket fuel, because first you got to make rocket fuel, and so you bringing in some crude oil, you're doing some advanced oil refinery of it, and then here, instead of doing cracking, I'm just doing solid fuel production. And then next, this train would move over here and then do the actual rocket fuel production. And then it would move over here, and this is where it produces the nuclear fuel. And then that nuclear fuel gets transported over to these refueling trains, and these are 2.6s, bidirectional 2.6s, but has to be symmetric for it to work in the, so we gotta add 2 at the other side too. So I guess technically they're 4.6s, but they're tiny, so it doesn't really matter. And then these get sent off to wherever they need to be. This is kind of a unique setup, and as you've noticed, there's actually some bots being used to move the fuel around, and then you might ask where the nuclear fuel is coming from. That's coming, or where the uranium's coming from, and that's coming from bots, but and it looks kind of partially unfinished. And the thing is, like, everything is being moved around with trains, and it's hard to calculate. Well, I didn't really try to calculate how much nuclear fuel do I actually need to be producing in order to feed all of these trains, because like all of these trains, like every 24 seconds this train moves, right? And every, what was this one, every 17 seconds this train moves up 780 like wagons, right? And like, how much fuel does that actually use? And then all these are moving, like all these trains are moving, and it's like, how much fuel do you actually need? And my answer was probably a lot, so let me just overbuild it so I have enough, and then worry about it later. And it turns out you do need a lot, but I did end up kind of overbuilding it too much. So once I actually figured out kind of reasonably how much I needed, and I didn't have to create such a large build. Instead of trying to like reconcile it, I just kind of use bots to fill it in. So in the end, you needed a lot, but not a tremendous amount. So if we go to 50 hours, production and consumption. So you end up consuming about 30 a minute, which is a lot, but it's not like an obscene amount. It is kind of a lot because they only stack to 1, so that's definitely a lot, but I was expecting, I don't know what I was expecting. I was expecting an obscene amount, but this is, you only need about 30 a minute. So I just kind of use bots to fill in the end. So then where is the uranium coming from? Well, I had made a dedicated uranium build, and it follows the same principles as all the other outposts. You do direct insertion, mining the ore into the train, and then you convert the ore into the slightly refined process to the slightly refined uranium. And then you just use the Kovacs process to convert the lower tier uranium into the higher tier uranium. And you just repeat that a lot because it takes a while. And you just cycle the train through. And it's actually surprisingly that simple, right? Because the Kovacs process is kind of complicated because you gotta you put in some, and then you get out some, and you gotta put what you got out, you gotta put that back in, and then you gotta supplement that with a little bit more, and then you gotta siphon off your output too, right? So it means you end up with a fairly complicated process. However, these wagons are basically just big chests. So as it turns out, all you have to do is just input and output, and it just resolves everything else. It just takes in what it needs. It puts all outputs into the big chest, and then it just brings in what it needs, and that's it. No filters, no wires. It's just that simple. It's just a big chest. So the final and most important topic of them all is the UPS and the efficiency of the base. And how bad is it? Well, right now I'm just standing still, and I can just zoom in, and we're getting about 36, 38 FPS. This seems a little bit lower than I'd expect. Typically I get like 44 FPS, maybe because I'm recording and a little bit of background stuff going on, so it's dropping a couple FPS, but I expect in this setup right now about an average about 44 FPS, which puts it in the solidly okay category. Right now it's a 5K science per minute base, but probably some things you could do to scale it up to 7K or 7.5K. There's nothing you could do to scale it to 10K or above. It's just simply the mechanisms that I use to build the base on, they just simply won't scale that high. So of course we can look at the time usage. Yes. Right, so update time is 23 seconds. It jumps around a lot. So first we have circuit networks with almost nothing. This is to be expected, as there's no monitoring network, and there's only a few circuits that like satellite consumption and a couple of oils have some circuits on them, but overall there's very few circuits, so that makes sense. Transport lines is almost nothing. I'd expect it to be nothing. I don't know, there could be something going on in the mall right now, because that's basically just belts. So that's good. Fluid manager is just merging of the multi-threaded fluid line, so that's just whatever it happens to be, I guess. Heat manager is 0, that's because there's no nuclear. Entity update is 7.5 about, and that's okay. So I mean, that's in most bases this is where all of the UPS is going. However, for here it's just like 7 or 8, but still have to look at that. And of course we have assembly machines. Oh, I'll just like call that 1. That's kind of to be expected. It's just assembly machines. You gotta need those. Boilers, I guess I have a couple to burn off various like trees you pick up, but that's not part of anything. And here we get to the first kind of problematic one, in that the cars come from whenever you're transferring train to train, there's a car being used there as a static 3x2 chest, right? So there's cars, all of these, there's actually quite a few cars. And for being a static 3x2 chest, taking up, like, I don't know, I'll just say 0.2, I'm gonna guess these are milliseconds, is kind of annoying and really just shouldn't be happening. It should be like 0 because it's literally just a chest. However, because it's a car and because it's an entity who can move and such, I think it has to do certain like collision checks, even if it's still static. And I mean, this used to be horrendous. Used to not be able to place any cars really. But so I guess I should be thankful that it's this low. But I wish it was. I wish it was just 0 because it's literally just a 3x2 chest. But it is what it is. Character deciders, sure, whatever. Enemy spawners. I guess these are the biter nests. It's basically 0. I mean, the nests are still here. Pollution is still here. But not really spawning much. Furnaces are about 1. I mean, it just is what it is. Generators, I don't remember what those are. It doesn't matter, though. They're low. Inserters, so this is the other big one. Inserters are, I don't know, I'll just call that 2.5. And spend 2.5, yeah, real fast autosave there. Spend 2.5 milliseconds on inserters, or maybe 3 milliseconds on inserters in a 5K science base. I mean, it could be lower, but that's definitely reasonable. I think that's reasonable. Labs are what they are. Logistic robots are basically 0. Mining drills simply are what they are. Offshore pumps are what they are. And then we get to the next one of pumps. So this is like 4.4 milliseconds. And that's not, I mean, it's not a whole lot. However, the problem with that, let's see. Is that, right, so I've placed 3.6K and I've picked up 1.8K. This means that there's 1.8K on the map somewhere. Does that make sense? Yeah, about 1.8K. This means that there's 1.8K pumps, which is not that, well, too many, but like it's not that many, and it's consuming a lot of resources to update. Like you compare that to something like assemblers where there's like 10K, but to update those assemblers it only takes like double the time, but you're like 5 timing the amount of entities, which means that the calculation per entity on pumps is quite high. which is something that I could definitely do to limit. I could definitely probably just delete over half the pumps. You just don't need them. That would definitely help, and you could probably make this almost zero if you do a right build. Radars are jump around. Yes, you can delete radars, but then you can't control things from the map, and the only way to play the game is to play from the map when you get to this scale. Especially if trains, which are just so big, like you can't live without radars, so you just pay the price. Roboports, there's some various ones for the mall and for some supplies and stuff. It's almost nothing though. Briquette silos are almost nothing. Rockets are nothing. Spider vehicles are kind of high for what they're doing, which is nothing right now. Right now, there's no spider vehicles doing anything. And this kind of falls into the same category of cars, in that the cars are completely static right now, but they have the possibility to wake up. Same with the spider vehicles. They're all static right now, but they have the possibility to wake up. So in the meantime, you're just kind of wasting calculations on, I don't know, just collisions, I guess. Animations, maybe. Just kind of one of those things that I wish was just zero, but I use all the Spidertrons for building. I didn't do a build train. I've done build trains in previous builds, but this time I just went with all Spidertrons for building, and it works, but you do kind of pay the price here. I mean, obviously it's more when you're moving around and they're trying to follow each other and resolve all their legs and everything, and that I totally get. Like, that's fine. But when you're just static, I wish these would go lower than they do. And then we get the unit. I think these represent biters. So, I mean, there's definitely some biters out there. You could delete biters and get back, right, probably this full thing here. Same with wherever that other one was, the spawners. It's like 0.2, so it could definitely push you over an FPS or two, but I just kind of ignore it right now because I'm doing a fully vanilla base. And then we go back to these. Okay, so we have particle update. I guess there's no particles. That's great. Nothing's being generated. There's no error correction. Electric network. So this one, right, so I use solar. So here's the solar array, and this was all done by, not by hand, but it was done not by editor. It was done by Spidertron. And so all the solar panels and all the batteries get reduced into one entity, and that's great. And that's not what this time is. This time is the calculations of power consumption. So if an assembler is on all the time, well, then it's easy to know how much power it is, or it's consuming. Or if an assembler is off all the time, well, then it's easy to know how much power it's consuming, right? But if it's turning on and off, then you have to calculate how much power it's actually consuming. And as I kind of discussed earlier, is that while the trains are moving, that periodically turns off almost all the assemblers, which means none of the assemblers are like running all the time, nor stop. Well, obviously they're not stopping all the time, but ideally you'd have them running all the time, so you don't have to do this calculation of, well, how much power did they actually consume because they turned on and off. So that's just kind of a limitation of using this setup and having this direct insertion from trailer or from wagon to assembler. It's not a huge price, 1.5 seconds or 1.5 milliseconds, but I mean, that could be lower, and that's where that comes from. Logistic manager, that's the believe that's logistic bots. I mean, basically nothing. Construction is construction bots. That's basically nothing. Pathfinder is for biters, I believe. So that should be basically nothing. And then here we go. Here we get to the big one. I wonder what is consuming all my UPS on this base. I just wonder what it could be. I just can't figure it out. Is it the 730 trains? Is it the 4,300 stations? Is it the let's see. Oh, wow. And you want wagons, right? So is it the is it the 40,000 cargo wagons? Is it the 17,000 locomotives? I wonder what the issue is. And so what's consuming all the UPS in the base? And if you guess trains, well, you're right. It's just the trains. Literally just the trains. Which is kind of just unfortunate. Because there's the idea of the base is to do more, bigger, better trains. And at some point you just reach the hard limit of trains. Each entity on the train just costs some amount of calculations. And so you're just pretty much hard capped on the number of trains you can do. Which just kind of limits the design space. So one thing to note here is that while I do have 730 trains trying to figure out how to get to 4,000 stations, look at that train pathfinder. It's literally like almost nothing. And I think that's one thing that I didn't really expect in this base, but turned out really well was the way I set up the train network and the way I set up the stations. And it really just it's just like it's like nothing for all these trains. So I guess the question is, so I want to kind of explain how I did that. And so the trains are just, these are kind of like, it's the same thing that comes with the Spidertrons, and the same thing comes with the cars. Even if they're static, even if they're idle, they still have to run like collision calculations or wake up calculations or some kind of vehicle calculation. And no matter what they're doing or what they're not doing, it doesn't matter. There's just some floor to it, and that floor is not zero, right? Where you think of like a belt that is statically, that isn't moving, that's full and not moving, or it could be full and moving. And that floor for having zero calculations, or excuse me, that floor is at zero. It can do zero calculations to like continually update. But for trains and for vehicles, that floor is not zero. That floor is some fractional number, which means that there's just kind of a hard cap on the number of train entities you can just have in the world. Even if there's no collisions, and I've never had a collision, and my train network is perfect, you still gotta check every single wagon and every single locomotive on every single bend. It's gotta check for collisions, and it's just kind of an unfortunate side effect. So the efficiency of the train network and train scheduling. Let's look at an example schedule. And we previously looked at steel because these have the longest schedules because they have the largest number of loops and the largest number of stations between loops. So you'll see something interesting about these, or maybe you saw these before. So the very first station is described, has a descriptor to it. That is, it's the steel icon, the purple science icon, and then US_2. So that means steel for purple science, unload station number 2. And that's because there's 2 purple science lines, right? So that's pretty well self-described. That's a great variable name. And then we look at the next ones, and it's U1, U2, U3, U4, etc. up to 8. And those are, right, those are for unload station 1, then 2, then 3, etc. And those are fairly well self-described. However, I've dropped all of the descriptors, right, such as this is for purple science number 2, this is for purple science, this is the steel for purple science, right? All those descriptors are gone. And then you'll see the same pattern for the outposts. So the first station is iron ore, iron plate, steel, purple science, start, number 2, right? So that's fully described. But then the rest of the stations are just O1, O2, etc., etc. And those are for outpost station 1, outpost station 2, right? And you'll see that the pattern is that the first one is fully described, and the second one is, and then the remaining are just partially described. And this is steel, and this is the same for all the steel. Pattern is the same throughout the entire base. This is for iron plate, similar thing. The first station is fully described, and the rest of the stations are not, right? And, right. So we can look at stations count then, stations, and before we were looking at unload stations, and if we look at these unload stations, what you'll see is that actually have 82 stations of the same name for all the secondary, for unload 1 through 8, or 81, right? And if we look at the we're looking at O's too, right? O's have a lot of stations too. It said go to outpost 1, but there's 81 stations with the name outpost 1. Right. So how in the heck, how is this efficient at all, right? So the key here is that we can look at one of these input stations as we have in the past, and as I've described in the past, you wind in, or the trains will target this station and wind in, and then when they hit it, they back out. And the key here is that when it backs out, the stations are on the opposite side of the track, which means that these stations that are on the opposite side of the track are not available to the global network, while these stations on the right side of the track are available to the global network. This means that these undescript train location or train stations are completely isolated from the global network and are like a local network that can only be accessed through the kind of like, I don't know, the global IP. You have and then you have a local IP kind of, and they're basically just like completely separate networks because the train stations are on the opposite side of the tracks. And so thus, when it's trying to pathfind inside of this like local network, it's really easy to pathfind, basically, because when it's sitting here looking for U1, it can either look to the global network or it can look at the local network, right? And the global network has no U1s accessible on it, so you can just kind of skip over that. But the local network has exactly one U1 available to it, and there's exactly one path to it, and it happens to just be the very first train stop you look at on that. The very first accessible train stop on the local network is the one you're looking for, right? And then when you're here at the local network at U1 and you're looking for U2, well, there's only one U2 in the entire network, and it just happens to be the very next one, and it just happens to be the very closest one, right? So it's like, all right, well, looking for U2, let me look at the very first option. Oh, there it is, right? And now you're at U2 and you're looking for U3. Let me just look at the next available option, and oh, the next one always happens to be the one that you're looking for. And basically the train station finder and the train pathfinder is able to efficiently take advantage of these basically like local networks and global network separation kind of thing. And this means that these staged stations are really efficient to use. And I use them everywhere, basically, you know. I guess I should note, these mixed trains on these loops, right? These loops are isolated, so there is no connection to the global network or any other local network. So they're basically like their own local network. Let me just see where this one's at right now. 11, all right. So right here. So it's at U11, or excuse me, W11. I think W is just a random letter I haven't used for anything. So I just use W for these. Right, so it's at U11 and it'll be, excuse me, it's at W11 and at some point it'll be looking for W12. But on this local network, there is only one W12 and there's only one path to W12. And it just happens to be the next available train stop at all. So it's efficient to find, and it's efficient to path to it, right? So, and that just makes the pathfinding almost non-existent, right? The only time that you have to do any real kind of pathfinding is that when you're going to these, you know, your first address basically, and right, and you're going from like an unload station to the outpost, right? And then you got to figure out your train network to it, right? And then you got to figure out how you're gonna actually path there. Congratulations, you made it to the end of all my ramblings. Why are you here? Here's a picture of my cat as a reward.